Hail and well met, brave adventurers. Welcome to another Meet the Dungeon Master with your host, me, DM Bob Yo. Today I have with me Elizabeth from startplaying.game and startplaying.games, Liz, as they like to go by. And so welcome, Liz. So good to have you.
Hey, nice to be here.
Good, good. So tell us a little bit about you. What do we need to know about Liz?
Um, well, I started running games about 12 years ago. I grew up overseas, so I have experience with a whole bunch of different places. As may probably be evident to a lot of people, I'm trans, which is its own thing. And I'm off in Maryland trying to run some games to get some people excited about things.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, you said you grew up overseas. I didn't know that. Talk about that a little bit. Where have you
Oh,
lived
okay.
over the years?
So my dad was an accountant for the United States Agency for International Development. And as such, we went to a bunch of developing nations. So while I was born in Pennsylvania, I was only there maybe a month before I went back overseas with my parents to Honduras for about a year. And then about 4 years in Pakistan, 4 years in Botswana, which Botswana was actually really nice at the time. It's Botswana wasn't considered a developing nation. It was considered developed, but everywhere around it was not. So they put their headquarters there. Unfortunately, since the time I was living there, Botswana has become one of the hotbeds for the AIDS epidemic. So I doubt it's quite as nice as I remember, but it was really interesting growing up somewhere where you got to, in Africa, where you get to go on safaris and see animals and meet people from all over the place. Um, then I lived in the Republic of Georgia for 2 years, in Maryland for four, and then the Dominican Republic for three before I left there for college. I went back to Maryland for my college experience, spent a brief time with my parents in Benin, and then came back to the United States.
Wow, that is just so cool. I mean, we could spend all our time together just talking about all the places you've lived. How neat! Yeah, how
We
neat is
could.
that? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, just the variety, and I have to think that that contributes to your so as DMs, we gather, right? We pick pieces from everywhere, from the things that we've read, but more than and things that we've watched, the movies, and you can't help but occasionally have tropes that you incorporate, even on a subconscious level. But you have lived experiences of I can only imagine this, in the United States here, and this is nothing against us, but we're a relatively young culture, and so our oldest buildings, if we come across, let's say, a church in New England that's
Oh
at
yeah.
this point that's 400 years old, that's ancient to us. Whereas in several places you mentioned, the Republic of Georgia and Pakistan, and you have just sort of these ancient, truly ancient buildings and
Oh
cultural
yeah.
relevance.
And it's
How
I
cool
mean
is that?
it's is really cool. It is a little bit of a mixed bag because by the same token, growing up with a parent in the government, you are kind of it's this weird mix because in some ways I was actually very sheltered. We had walls around our houses, tight security. But on the other hand, I've seen so many really cool and interesting places and experienced other cultures. Like it's a thing I often find with role playing games, particularly modern and urban fantasy settings. There is a tendency for things to always be set in like the United States, and people don't think too much about I remember this being an issue sometimes when I'd read like World of Darkness books. I think some of the later books address this a bit, but there's a lot of just not talking about what goes on in the rest of the world. Like, I cannot believe, for example, that in an urban fantasy setting in Africa, the masquerade works, that people don't know about monsters. Because when I was in Benin, I talked to college educated, well-spoken people who, I didn't speak French, but these were people who worked for the embassy and spoke English, and they believed in witches. Like, it's just a thing that people accept about the world. And it makes me think, when I see all these fantasy settings, they're like, we hide the supernatural from the world. And I'm just like, there's no way that happens everywhere in the world, even if it happens in the US.
Well,
Um,
and not as heavy of a need, so to speak, to hide, because
no,
in cultures where you have very animistic beliefs, for example, and whatnot, the idea that such things would be surprising, right? And
yeah.
so you mentioned Vampire the Masquerade. That's a good question. So tell me a little bit about the games that you've played. I mean, what's your gaming experience? I
Uh,
can't imagine you started in Pakistan playing D&D in the embassy, but maybe so. I don't know. You tell me.
oh no, my parents actually met a group of D&D players, or I don't know the exact story, but whoever they were apparently came on really strong and freaked my parents out. So my parents didn't have that kind of stuff around the house. They weren't big fantasy buffs or anything. So my first real exposure was in very indirect, but in Botswana, um, in my elementary school library, they had fighting fantasy game books. And I remember, I think the first one I picked up was Crypt of the Sorcerer, and I fell in love with it. Like, they unfortunately didn't have that many books, but I got every kind of adventure book they had, particularly the fighting fantasy. And I always forget the name of this one because it's one I've like only ever saw the one book of because my brother got it from a friend, called Where the Shadows Stalk, I think, which was, I didn't realize this at the time, but the first time I ever experienced like Lovecraftian literature was this adventure book that had sand rolls and everything. And I remember really liking, I mean, in some ways, this is also what introduced me to the fantasy genre. It's what got me interested in reading more and writing. But in the back of my head, I thought about the dice rolls and the mechanics and how those stories worked. And years later, as I got into middle school, I got into Magic the Gathering. And as I got into high school, I got more and more interested in role playing games. But I was in the Dominican Republic. I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately. And the school I went to was very small, so I didn't have like a lot of people to game with. Um, the first game I ever ran was basically I made a game to make like a superheroes thing. We only had like one session of it because I didn't really get people together. Then I managed to get a hold of Kobolds Ate My Babies, of all things. And a thing I wish I could still find, because there used to be a free PDF, but it seems to have disappeared. But the Star Wreck role playing game based off the finished series of parody movies that I loved because it had all of these Star Trek jokes, like instead of hit points when you were down on the ground, you had red shirts who would always die before you did. um, but unfortunately, my friends that were I was trying to play games with had never really watched Star Trek, so the whole thing was kind of lost. Um,
So how does that compare to like Lower Decks? Have you watched the Lower Decks
I have
series at
I
all?
have I've seen clips, but not the show itself.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
Lower Decks is
what it
probably,
reminds me of.
yeah, it's much. I mean, the Star Wreck movies are just weird because they start off as these weird, dumb little animated films, and then one of them's a half-hour live thing, and then the next one is a full-length motion picture that was released in theaters and is a story where they parody Babylon 5 as well. The creators went on to make Iron Sky afterwards, same team, and Iron Sky is just a fabulous movie. Um, but in role playing games, I kind of went from there into. I did a lot of research and found the Fate system, and I ran Spirit of the Century when it was still pretty new, and through Evil Hat Productions, Don't Rest Your Head. And those games ended up being the first ones that when I got to college, I managed to get proper campaigns of going. It was still very catch as catch can. I didn't have like a consistent group. Uh, But after those, I had a very long and successful game of Smallville and a few paranoia one shots. And basically, I, during college, collected a huge number of different games and did one shots and campaigns whenever I got half a chance. And from there, uh, as I moved into where I currently am in Maryland, I met a group of people, and we have a gaming club here called the Historic Haven. That's I met a huge number of people through, and a lot of my particularly New World of Darkness experience comes from playing games with them. It was one of the first times where I was consistently a player since I'd always been running the games up until this point. But I've played World of Darkness, Dark Heresy. We got super into Unknown Armies Second Edition. Uh, yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. No, I think what I'm most fascinated about listening to you talk about, the games that you've played and your sort of how you started out and whatnot is, being old as dirt. I started out in the 80s and in 1983 there were a couple already derivatives of D&D by that point, but they were, unless you had already been playing Dungeons and Dragons, you weren't going to have heard of Rollmaster or the other early derivatives of D&D. And so, I cut my teeth on D&D, and then, my first experience with another game wasn't until the 90s, probably 10 years, more than 10 years after I had first played Dungeons and Dragons. Even then it was Middle Earth role-playing game, right? So just another fantasy setting, albeit one with some very independent lore and very different mechanics. But it wasn't for me until much later that I spent any significant amount of time playing anything else. I will put a footnote in there. We dabbled a little bit in Marvel superheroes role playing in the mid 80s, the phase rip system.
It comes up a lot.
Yeah, it was a fun little system, but we probably played half a dozen times, and so then by the 2000s, I started to go to Gen Con, if not every year, every couple of years, and that really opened my eyes to lots of different games, and that's when I did some World of Darkness, joined in some live action Vampire, which us old grumpy curmudgeonly gamers from the 80s like to make fun of the larpers back then, but man, it was a blast. Live action Vampire was a blast, and so did that for a good couple of years. I always gravitate back to D&D for whatever reason, but I am fascinated by some of the games that some I've heard of. Obviously Smallville, I've obviously heard of the Smallville RPG, and Kobolds Ate My Babies. But the others that you mentioned, fighting fantasy, and just kind of fascinating.
Well, the fighting fantasy game books I find fascinating because it's Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, but not that Steve Jackson until later. They got a second Steve Jackson writing the books, and it is that Steve Jackson. But Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson wrote most of the fighting fantasy game books, and they're actually two of the three guys who founded Games Workshop. And they wrote the fighting fantasy game books because they actually secured distribution rights to selling D&D in the UK and I think Europe. So what they were doing was they made the fighting fantasy game books kind of intentionally as a little simplified rules, introductory things that you could have. Kids could pick up these books and read them and play through them. And they had very simple dice rolling mechanics, but they were kind of designed as a gateway into D&D, which I didn't learn till years later. But you can really tell in like the first of them, Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which I actually went back to look at more recently, is just like an old school dungeon. The story is paper thin. It doesn't make a lot of sense. There's traps everywhere. many of them without any good reason for being there, and you just have to try and survive.
It's funny. It's funny that you said that. We want to be, and even me, right? Again, having been around as these things were released and loved them as a kid, we want to be very critical of, of especially that aspect of the early role playing games. There is what story and why is there an aboleth in a dungeon with no water other than this random puddle? But I liken it to Tolkien, right? I mean, Tolkien was essentially inventing a genre and or reinventing an ancient genre. And reading Tolkien now is a little bit laborious at times. Still genius and seminal. But I would argue that modern fantasy writers, in some ways, have much more elegant product because they're building on
Oh, yeah.
on Tolkien and all that's come before.
Well, it's also, there's kind of a central question that I find with role playing games, which is how much of a game do you want it to be? And in personally, I like more role playing, I like more narrative driven things, I like my story, but I recognize the fact that the earliest versions of D&D were coming out of chainmail fantasy. They were games first, all the role playing stuff was second and kind of worked in later. And I see like the kind of discussion about how much things should be narrative driven and how much gameplay I find really interesting, because I like Cortex Plus or the One Roll engine, for example, that have, well, the Cortex Plus is a good example because I said I was running that Smallville game, and Smallville has a lot of mechanics. There's a lot going on that is a game, but instead of being like, here's a dungeon, try to find your way through and survive in this kind of very open gameplay, it really tries to make it so your gameplay decisions will always feed back into that story loop. And it's actually one of the things I love in I consider a mark of good game design, is having a structure where engaging with the gameplay will naturally tell a story. Because that way you get the people who just care about the numbers and are there to play the game still end up telling a story because the game kind of prods them in that direction.
Yeah, and Cortex Plus is indeed a great system for that, in my experience. I've played a handful of times, but I've talked to a lot of folks and that have played, and I've talked to some of the folks that did various designs, the various branded versions of Cortex Plus. You mentioned earlier talking about your first time as a player, you'd sort of been that forever DM. I'm fascinated by that term. I think it's a concept that's been around for a long time among gaming, but really I hear it a lot more lately. I'm a forever DM, and in some way, some folks, and I don't, you maybe not fully, they'd rather be playing or something like that. What do you think? How do you feel about that?
I mean, I started running games right out the gate. I've never regretted it. I've played in various games. Like my first time really as a player for a long-term game was actually also my first experience of D&D 3.5. Wasn't terribly thrilled with it. Part of that is, I think 3.5 in particular, I never quite clicked with the mechanics, but also the DM was running a kind of silly out there game, and I didn't feel a particular weight into the world, like hooks to really invest in it. And what I've found in most cases is I would rather run a game because, not to sound entirely egotistical, but in most cases, in my experience, I can run a better game than most of the people I know.
Well, and
Um,
at the very least, you run a game that's more your style than the rest of the
sure.
people and that's how I tell it to people. It's not that I have all these bad DMs. It's just that I
Yeah.
know what kind of game I like to play.
I mean, I've had good DMs, I've had bad DMs, I've had, like, to me, there is, I had one person, I'm going to drop a first name here, but Conrad, who I met through the Haven, is the best GM I've ever played with. He's incredibly good, and he shares a lot of my taste and styles. And so, for the past few years, as I've been doing stuff at the Haven, most of my games are either me running or him running, and a lot of it's with the has been with kind of the same group of people. More recently, I've been branching out to get more people involved and try with different groups. But over the course of running and playing each other's games, and right now we're actually co-running a Vampire Chronicles of Darkness variant that's not really the Requiem or Masquerade. We're running it together, and the game is going great. But I think the two of us have learned so much from each other, just being in each other's games and seeing how we operate, and especially back before ordinary life started catching up with us again, for a while, talking till 3 in the morning about the games we'd just been playing.
Right, right. No, and that was, in my younger years, they say before life catches up with you, that was, I think the fun of the game was talking about it afterwards and before planning for the next session,
Oh,
I,
I mean,
yeah,
I did in college for a thing that I don't think I could ever quite capture again. I had a friend ask me to run Paranoia, which I'd never run before. I'd never played before. I got handed a copy of I believe it's the Paranoia XP edition, an edition which the next edition tried to claim never happened. Uh, but I liked it well enough, and I came up with a basic one-shot scenario, handed people some pre-gen characters, let them define a few things about themselves, and the game went on for 12 hours. Like, we started and it just kept going, and we lost a couple of the people along the way because they had other things to do, but for 12 hours we were just in the thick of Paranoia, people getting themselves killed and conniving against each other until the whole thing climaxed with somebody getting a sector nuked during the debriefing, and one person with one clone left was still standing.
that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I remember in the 90s, the mid 90s. So just before I got married and had kids, um, some friends of mine and I, a couple of which, and one of which I still play with on a semi-regular basis to this day, my best friend Greg. Anyway, we would start Friday after, whoever it was that was working a regular 9 to 5 job at that point. I think it was just the one guy probably. But we'd start after work on Friday, and we would just play, and we'd stop and maybe sleep for a few hours here and there. But we played until Sunday night when Greg had to go in for third shift work. And so really, I mean, we were the better part of 48 hours, again, with obvious breaks to eat and sleep a little bit. I look back on those times fondly. I don't have the stamina to do it at my age now. I'm almost 50, for Christ's sake. But you'd mentioned there's one thing that caught my ear there too. You talk about Paranoia XP edition and how the next edition they pretended didn't exist. I mean, I maintain and always will, and I'm going to lose viewers right now. I'm going to have people unfollow my Facebook page and ban my YouTube. But in my mind, fourth edition D&D was the most sublime edition in
Oh,
terms of the rule set. And
absolutely.
and we want to forget that happened, and I'm glad the edition wars are over, and I played my share of Pathfinder and loved it too.
Like,
But
the thing I will always maintain is that fourth edition, and I didn't play it very much, but I played like a one shot that somebody was running at like a college con, and it is an incredibly well made, well balanced, well thought through game that I just have no interest in, because what it does exactly what it's trying to do. I don't particularly want to do that. And this is like 3.5 in Pathfinder. I'm not huge fan of, because I think the way the rules interact with the narrative is very janky. But kind of what they're broadly trying to do, or in fact, the way that they're kind of not trying to do one thing and just kind of sprawl all over the place, makes a more appealing game to me, because it's more likely to engage with things I'm interested in. Whereas Fourth edition is just a superb board game, but it never felt like a role-playing game to me, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does, and that's a common observation. And I can't speak for the experience of others. I can just speak for mine. And I really think it does have, and this goes true with just about any gaming system in my experience. The DM and their ability to draw players into a narrative and make them part of it, and then make the player input part of the narrative. I think it's definitely awesome when there are mechanics that allow that to happen and that encourage it. But I think there's a certain type of DM that's able to do that. And when you have a DM like that, you could be playing, your entire rule set could be 500 pages just on the combat section, or it could all fit on an index card. And either way, I think you can have a good story.
I mean,
all right.
I would say there's definitely truth to that, but I do find with certain games, I've enjoyed them in spite of the rules rather than because of the rules.
Absolutely.
Where
Absolutely.
some games, the DM can do that with even terrible games. I'm sure that somewhere out there's a perfectly fun game of Fatal, but it's not because of the rules. It's in spite of them.
No, you're probably right there too.
And that's, like I said, fourth edition did something extremely well. I just wasn't that interested in what it was
doing. All right, so all right, what do you like to run? What's your favorite system today to run?
Okay. I'm going to slightly cheat this one and say that the most fun I have running games is Dread. I think you mentioned this on your last interview.
Yeah.
One of the early ones. Unfortunately, it doesn't translate well online, but Dread is this superb game. For anyone who hasn't played it, the rules are pretty simple. If you're trying to do something difficult, you make a pull from a Jenga tower. If it's really difficult, you might have to make more than one pull. If you collapse the tower, your character is dead. Maybe driven insane, maybe driven out of the plot in another way, but for the most part, you're dead. And it is the most, I talked before about how I love games that have what I consider elegant design, that they marry the actual game mechanics to the story. And Dread is the most perfect example of that, because the sheer Jenga on its own is already a weirdly suspenseful game where everybody holds their breath and stares at the tower while someone's making a pull. And then to hinge the life or death of a fictional character on that same moment is just perfect one shots. But
oh yeah, absolutely.
The one
you watch a dice roll and you're like, oh, it's my last death saving throw and there's no one here to heal me yet. And you watch that with some anticipation, but not like with Jenga, right? Because I mean, yeah.
But it's all like there are some downsides. The big one being Jenga's not very good, or Dread is not very good for a long-term campaign. The other one I've run into is that because it relies on actual physical dexterity, it's not a great game if you have somebody in your group who has cerebral palsy, as I do in most of my groups these days, or other problems. We still played it, you still had fun, but there's like a clear disadvantage.
Yeah, I can see that too, for sure. When I played, everyone didn't have any of those kinds of physical challenges, so it had not occurred to me, but that's actually a great point.
Yeah.
So
it's also I will say that my favorite game for running long-term campaigns, though, to date at least, this one changes more frequently, I think, is Progenitor, which is a specific setting for the Wild Talents system that is a superhero game that posits that in 1967, this woman from Kansas gets Dr. Manhattan level superpowers. And the next, she figures out that she has these, stays quiet for a bit. Then the Tet offensive gets on the news. And the next day she goes to the draft office and shows that she has powers and says she wants to help the war effort. But what she doesn't know at that point, and what nobody knows for a while, is that whenever she uses her powers on somebody, or for the first 10 people she uses her powers on, actually, they get superpowers. slightly less than hers, but still really powerful. And then for those 10 people, they have a 90% chance each time they use their powers to give somebody else superpowers until they've given 9 people superpowers. Then those people have an 80% chance of spreading to 8 more, so on down the line, which is already a really cool premise because it means that, you know, when you have a villain who rips someone's arm off or does something horrible with their brain, you might make a new character that way who now has superpowers and goes after them. But what really makes the game sing, and that I keep trying to run this game and I get at most a few years into it, but it has a detailed timeline that talks about what happens in the real world and what happens in setting that runs from 1968 all the way to 1999. And it has a giant list of all these characters who are important to the setting, and like really good. It's written by Greg Stolze, probably one of my favorite role-playing game designers. And every one of these characters has like fully fleshed out motivations and crazy superpowers. So you watch like what happens when people in Vietnam on both sides of the conflict start getting superpowers. What happens when Russia, the Soviet Union, basically doesn't get enough people with superpowers to compete in the Cold War and the global race anymore. Like what happens when, you know, it avoids the problem comics have where Reed Richards is supposedly a genius, but everything looks the same. So it's just like, no, people build like fusion reactors to power countries, and you know, flying cars enter the market. People make like mimetic, they're called syntergenes in the book, but they're basically really powerful subconscious mimetic programming that like change the course of history. Because when you have all of these super geniuses running around, stuff goes crazy. And I love that setting.
I'm going to have to look into that because that sounds fascinating to me. I was in another life, I was a history major. Did my
It's also
my undergrad and a master's. So that's
the other
fascinating.
thing I should add is it also leaves a lot of room for the players themselves to screw with history. So if you have a player walk in with like the gadgeteering ability and they just like make a really cheap, affordable like death ray, suddenly all the armies of the world have death rays.
Cheap, affordable death ray. All right, yeah. All right. So, Liz, you've been amazing today. And before we wrap up, tell me a little bit about what you've got going on at startplaying.games, what kind of games you're running, what people can expect if they sign up, how often you're running. Talk a little bit about what you got going on.
Right now, I'm trying to run a handful of games a week. Mostly, I've been focusing on doing free-to-play one-shots so people can get a taste for both my GMing style and hopefully a few systems that they might not be familiar with. I do, for all that I talk about, like 4th edition and 3.5, I actually do like 5th edition D&D quite a bit, but don't have much experience playing it or running it. So I'm trying to get some one-shots down to give me a bit of practice, and then I'm going to try and lead into longer form campaigns. I've been wanting to flex some of my creative fantasy muscles, so there's probably going to be some 5th edition, but if I can get enough interest, I would love to get a long form progenitor game going again. Or I have some other ideas for like a super powered pirate game, and there's a game I'm currently running that I'd like to adapt to run for more people. That is, the premise is it's a fantasy world where you have a independent duchy, and the duke dies, and the player characters are left basically in charge, but they're also raising the duchess, who's only 6. Because I found that game's been really good and really fun, and I can't wait to try and show it to more people.
Oh, that sounds fun. That does sound a lot of fun. All right. Thank you again, Liz, for being with us today. And make sure you check out their link to their profile and start playing games. Sign up for some games, do the paid ones, and we do the free ones if you have to, but do the paid ones too. And then leave Liz a wonderful interview or a wonderful review when you're done as well. So, all right, everybody, thanks so much. That's another edition of GM Talk. My guest was Liz. Thank you again, Liz, for your time. And to all our viewers and listeners, we will see you out in the world.